The man who would go down in history as Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, in the United States of America. His father, Gabriel Capone, was a humble barber who had emigrated from Angri, a small village nestled just outside Naples, in southern Italy. Alongside him was Alphonse's mother, Teresa Capone, N.E. Teresa Raiola, a hard-working seamstress. Together, they would raise 9 children, forging a family amidst the crowded streets of Brooklyn. The Capones first set foot in New York in 1893, after initially passing through the port of Rijeka in Austria-Hungary, today's Croatia. Their first home in America was a modest apartment at 95 Navy Street, located in the bustling Navy Yard district of downtown Brooklyn. They were far from alone. During the 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s, a great wave of Italian immigrants, nearly 4 million strong, flooded into the United States, seeking refuge from the crushing poverty, rampant overpopulation, and stifling lack of opportunity that plagued the old country. In 1909, when young Alphonse was just 11 years old, the Capone family relocated to Park Slope, another Brooklyn neighborhood. Life in their crowded household was lively, with 8 siblings filling the rooms. Vincenzo, who later reinvented himself as Richard Hart, a Prohibition agent desperate to distance himself from his brother's criminal infamy, Raphael. James, better known as Bottles, who would eventually help manage Al's liquor empire. Salvatore, affectionately called Frank, who also worked alongside his infamous brother. And a sister, Ermina, whose life tragically ended at the age of 1. Other siblings included Ermino, who went by John, as well as Albert, Matthew, and a surviving sister named Mafalda Capone. In his early school years, Alphonse showed surprising promise, often returning home with glowing academic reports that filled his parents with pride. Yet his fiery temperament and disdain for authority soon clashed with the strict rules of his Roman Catholic upbringing. At just 14 years old, he was expelled from school after a violent incident in which he struck a PAC female teacher in the face. His formal education ended that day, but his apprenticeship in the world of crime was only beginning. As a teenager, Al Capone drifted through a series of odd jobs working in a bowling alley, assisting in a candy store, all while immersing himself in the gritty, crime-infested streets of Brooklyn. It was here that Capone encountered men who would profoundly shape his life, including Johnny Torrio, an Italian-born gangster known for his quiet intelligence and calculated demeanor, whom young Al regarded as a mentor. Crime was woven into the very fabric of Brooklyn life in those days, and Al soon found his place within it. He began with small-time gangs like the Bowery Boys and the Junior 40 Thieves in Lower Manhattan, before advancing to the Brooklyn Rippers and ultimately the 5 Points Gang, the most powerful criminal organization in Lower Manhattan at the time. Organized crime was not yet the national mafia syndicate it would later become, but rather a loose network of street gangs occasionally cooperating for mutual benefit. By 1917, Capone had come under the wing of Frankie Yale, a ruthless racketeer who ran a proption, lucrative protection racket, extorting local businesses by offering protection or more, accurately charging them to avoid his own violence. Yale eventually opened a bar, the Harvard Inn, in Coney Island, where Al worked as a bartender and doorman. It was at the Harvard Inn that Al Capone earned the nickname he despised, Scarface. One fateful evening, during a drunken scuffle, Capone made an ill-judged comment to Lena Galluccio, the striking sister of local gangster Frankie Galluccio. Enraged, Galluccio slashed Capone's face with a knife, leaving a permanent scar on his left cheek. For the rest of his life, Capone was self-conscious of the disfigurement, instructing photographers to shoot him from his right side to hide the mark. In later years, he would falsely claim the scar was a wartime injury, allegedly inflicted by a German gunner in the trenches of the First World War, a fabrication, as Capone had never served in the military. Another nickname by which Al Capone was known, this one far more personal, was Snorky, a slang term of the time for a sharp dresser, given to him affectionately by his closest friends. Over the years, he would also earn other monikers, including Big Al, Big Boy, and most famously, Public Enemy No. 1. Following the infamous altercation with Frankie Galluccio, Al was consumed by a desire for revenge. But high-ranking gangsters, seeking to keep peace within their fragile criminal alliances, intervened. Under their guidance, Capone and Galluccio made a surface-level actually reconciliation. Galluccio offered an apology for the scar he had inflicted, and Capone, despite his pride, gave his word that he would not seek retribution, a promise he remarkably honored even after rising to the top of the criminal world. Part of Al's willingness to forgive came from his understanding that Galluccio had only been defending his sister's honor. In the code of Italian-American gangsters, family was sacred, a principle Capone respected deeply. This respect for family became even more personal when, in December 1918, Capone's girlfriend, Mary Josephine Coughlin, gave birth to their son, Albert Francis Sonny Capone. With a child on the way, there was only one honorable course of action: marriage. And so, on the 30th of December, 1918, just a few weeks after Sonny's birth, the two were wed. Mary, an Irish Catholic, had been working at a local department store when she first met Al. At the time of their marriage, Al was just 19 years old, 2 years under the legal age for marriage in New York, meaning he had to obtain written consent from his parents. Mary was 21, slightly older than her young groom. Despite Al's well-known infidelities throughout their marriage, the relationship between Al and May remained, by all accounts, a happy and loving one until the very end of his life. Not long after his wedding, Capone's mentor, Johnny Torrio, offered him an opportunity that would change his life forever: a chance to move to Chicago. Torrio had been summoned west by Vincenzo Colosimo, better known as Big Jim Colosimo, one of Chicago's earliest Italian-American crime bosses. Born in southern Italy in 1878, Colosimo had immigrated to the United States in 1895, establishing himself in Chicago by 1902. Over the following years, Colosimo built a powerful criminal empire rooted in racketeering, prostitution, and illegal gambling. But by the late 1910s, new criminal factions were emerging in the city, and Big Jim needed reliable enforcers to help him protect his turf. Torrio, who had spent the 1910s moving between New York and Chicago and had worked for Colosimo in the past, agreed to return west. When the time came to expand their operations, Torrio reached out to Al Capone to join him. For Capone, the offer represented a new beginning, a fresh start in the Windy City, both professionally and personally. In 1919, Capone packed up his young family and left Brooklyn behind for Chicago, where he quickly found work as a bouncer in a brothel. But the new life came with risks. It was during this period, shortly after arriving in Chicago, that Capone contracted syphilis, likely from a prostitute working at the very brothel where he was employed. This infection would prove to have devastating long-term effects. Syphilis, a bacterial disease primarily spread through sexual contact, often presents early symptoms like a skin rash, wart, like sores, fever, and swollen glands. While these initial signs eventually subside, the bacteria remain dormant in the body, quietly wreaking havoc over the years. At the time, syphilis was poorly understood and difficult to treat, particularly during the 1920s. The infection typically entered a latent phase, remaining inactive for years, sometimes over a decade, before manifesting in far more serious ways. If left untreated, as it tragically was in Capone's case, the disease would eventually attack the body's vital systems, damaging the eyes, heart, nervous system, and ultimately the brain itself. And so it was that syphilis, quietly ravaging his body, would ultimately bring about Capone's downfall, far more than the relentless efforts of American law enforcement. In hindsight, it seems likely that Salvarsan, a groundbreaking drug newly available in the United States, could have cured Capone in the early stages of infection. Yet, either through pride, ignorance, or neglect, he never sought treatment until it was far too late, and by then the disease had already caused irreversible damage. While his health quietly deteriorated, Capone's criminal career was about to ascend to extraordinary heights. Even as he traveled west from New York to Chicago in 1919, Congress was in the process of passing one of the most transformative and controversial pieces of legislation in American history, the 18th Amendment. This amendment, along with the Volstead Act, passed in January 1919 and coming into force in early 1920, banned the BOGO, end of quote, unlicensed production, transportation, and sale of alcohol at the federal level. Although Prohibition was the product of decades of campaigning by the temperance movement and the Anti-Saloon League, its enforcement disproportionately affected immigrant communities, Irish, Italian, and German Americans, who had long dominated the bar, saloon, and brewing trades. Instead of eliminating these businesses, Prohibition simply drove them underground, creating fertile ground for the rise of organized crime. What emerged in the early 1920s was a new wave of criminal empires, especially in cities like New York, Chicago, and others where Italian and Irish gangs were already established. In many ways, the Italian-American mafia, as it came to be known, was born from the Prohibition era, and soon Al Capone would rise to become its most famous figure, at least in Chicago. Just months after Prohibition began, Big Jim Colosimo was murdered in Chicago under mysterious circumstances. While Capone's involvement is unlikely, the killing cleared the way for Johnny Torrio to seize power, establishing himself as one of the city's leading crime bosses. In turn, Capone was promoted rapidly, rising from a mere bouncer to one of Torrio's trusted captains. In no time, Capone was running one of Chicago's major bootlegging operations. One key method of supplying illegal alcohol was to smuggle it down from Canada, where alcohol could still be legally produced and shipped, though Prohibition was beginning to take hold in parts of Canada as well. The Great Lakes, forming a porous border between Canada and the U.S., were nearly impossible for authorities to police effectively, creating a perfect route for smugglers. Alternatively, liquor was produced locally in illegal distilleries, still scattered across remote areas like the Dakota Plains, and then transported into Chicago. Once in the city, the alcohol flowed into countless speakeasies, the clandestine bars where the thirsty public gathered in defiance of federal law. As the Roaring Twenties gathered momentum, Capone, Torrio, and their crew began making enormous sums of money, fueled by America's undiminished appetite for booze. But bootlegging was just the start. Capone's empire soon expanded into racketeering, gambling, prostitution, and virtually any illegal enterprise that promised a profit. Meanwhile, life for the Capone family in Chicago was becoming more comfortable. In 1923, Al bought a modest home at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in the Park Manor neighborhood, on the city's south side, paying $5,500 for the property. He also dabbled in boxing promotion, though this was little more than a cover for his illicit operations, which by now were being carried out under the banner of the Chicago outfit, also known as the South Side Gang. Capone had a taste for the high life. He wore fine, custom-made suits, smoked thick cigars, and dined only on the finest cuisine. He adorned himself with flashy jewelry and surrounded himself with beautiful women, a lifestyle far more ostentatious than most of his underworld peers who preferred to keep a low profile. Capone, by contrast, embraced the spotlight. He enjoyed being cheered at baseball games and reveled in his public image. To many ordinary people, he projected the aura of a modern-day Robin Hood, giving generously to charity from his vast, illicit fortune. When asked to explain his extravagant lifestyle and illegal activities, Capone's typical response was cool and dismissive, reflecting the supreme confidence of a man who saw himself as untouchable. When asked about his illegal enterprises, Capone might respond with lines like, "I am just a businessman giving the people what they want," or "All I do is satisfy a public demand." But behind this cool exterior, Chicago's criminal underworld was shifting. In 1923, the political landscape of Chicago changed dramatically with the election of reformist Mayor William Emmett Dever, a man determined to crack down on organized crime. Anticipating interference and unwanted scrutiny from City Hall, Capone and Torrio decided it was time to relocate their operations beyond the city limits. They chose the nearby suburb of Cicero, Illinois, a quiet town that was ripe for takeover. It was from Cicero that Capone and the Southside Gang expanded their empire. Brothels, speakeasies, and gambling dens sprang up across the town, all operating under Capone's control. They expanded their liquor network, supplying nearly every saloon in Cicero. To secure their grip on power, they used a potent mix of bribery, intimidation, and violence, even going so far as to influence local elections, most notably the 1,924 Cicero municipal elections. This move to Cicero provided Capone with a double advantage. First, it placed him outside the jurisdiction of reform-minded officials in Chicago. Second, it made it much harder for rival gangs, especially the North Side gang, who sought to muscle in on his rum-running trade to reach him. At the time, Cicero was governed by Joseph Z. Klena, a corrupt Republican politician who, alongside his bipartisan administration, had faced little opposition in recent elections. He had ruled Cicero for 3 consecutive terms, largely thanks to the protection and support of the South Side gang, aided by Capone's brother, Frank Capone. But in 1924, the Democratic Party finally mounted a serious challenge. Promising to clean up Cicero, they ran their own candidates and posed a real threat to the corrupt status quo. The Mani Tabelno election was scheduled for the 1st of April, 1924, and sensing danger, Mayor Klena turned to Torrio, Capone, and the Chicago outfit for help. In exchange for securing his re-election, Klena offered the gangsters an unofficial immunity from prosecution in Cicero. Capone and his men readily accepted. They brought in around 200 gangsters, including members of their own crew and others from allied outfits, to ensure the election went Klena's way. What followed was a brutal campaign of violence and terror. In the days leading up to the election, they launched targeted stabbings, shootings, kidnappings, and widespread intimidation. On the eve of the vote, they attacked William Billy Flaum, the Democratic nominee for town clerk, beating his face and trashing his campaign offices. His wife was reportedly thrown against a wall during the assault. The violence escalated on Election Day, the 1st of April. Voters were met at polling stations by gangsters armed with submachine guns and sawed-off shotguns who made sure that ballots were cast for Klena. Supporters of Klena were allowed to vote multiple times, while those brave enough to vote against him were beaten or barred from voting again. Armed cars patrolled the streets, packed with Capone's gunmen, who targeted opposition leaders. Rudolph Hurt, the Democratic challenger for mayor, saw his campaign headquarters riddled with bullets. Another Democratic candidate was pistol-whipped in front of his own family, and the violence didn't stop there. In the campaign offices of yet another political rival, Frank Capone, Al's brother, personally led an assault, ruthlessly beating those who stood in the way of their control. The violence only escalated as the day wore on. Several campaign officials were beaten, senseless, polling stations were stormed, and ballots were ripped directly from voters' hands. Some voters were shot, stabbed, or viciously beaten in the streets by so-called sluggers, hired thugs whose only task was to spread fear. One campaign worker, Joseph Price, was tied up, gagged, and brutally assaulted by Capone's gang. Another Democrat, Stanley Stankovich, was kidnapped, blindfolded, and held captive in a Chicago basement, ensuring he couldn't vote before the polls closed. Even the police were not immune from the chaos. One officer was beaten and disarmed, left defenseless as gangsters roamed the streets. Despite the apparent success of Capone's effort to manipulate the Cicero elections, the operation came at a high personal cost. A Democratic campaigner, Michael Gavin, was shot in both legs and imprisoned, along with 8 other campaign workers in the basement of a mob-controlled Chicago hotel, all to prevent them from casting their ballots. Late in the afternoon, a desperate call for help finally reached Cook County Judge Edmund K. Jarecki, who responded by dispatching 70 Chicago police officers, organized into 5 squads of detectives and 9 squads of uniformed patrolmen in vehicles, to put an end to the lawlessness in Cicero. As the police approached, they spotted Al Capone, his brother Frank Capone, and gangsters like Dave Hedlund and Charles Fischetti. Without hesitation, the officers leapt from their cars, guns drawn. A fierce gun battle erupted. In the exchange, Frank Capone was shot dead and Hedlund was wounded. Al Capone and Fischetti managed to escape, though Fischetti later surrendered. Al Capone gave his brother a lavish funeral, spending an estimated $220,000 on flowers alone, many of which were supplied by the florist business of none other than Dean O'Banion, an Irish-American bootlegger and rival who used his flower shop as a front for illegal activities. O'Banion would soon play a far greater role in Capone's story. Mourners wept bitterly for Frank Capone, so young and suddenly lost. Yet observing quietly, from a distance, were the very same police officers who had gunned him down, a harsh reality of life in Chicago's underworld. But for Capone, running the Cicero mob meant constant danger. Assassination attempts from rival gangsters and the threat of law enforcement raids were ever present. Though his bribery and political influence protected him to a point, Capone remained a prime target. He was extremely security conscious, always traveling with heavily armed bodyguards. In the early 1920s, Capone's personal driver was found tortured and murdered, and Capone himself narrowly escaped an assassination attempt in the Chicago Loop, the city's bustling business district. Meanwhile, Torrio and Capone continued to solidify their claim as Chicago's most powerful crime syndicate. But they faced stiff competition from other groups, notably the North Side Gang and the Genna brothers. Though the Gennas were Torrio's allies, they frequently clashed with Dean O'Banion, the head of the North Side Gang and a key player in the bootlegging trade. Tensions worsened when the Genna brothers began selling cut-rate liquor to O'Banion customers, undermining his business. Torrio, instead of intervening, either turned a blind eye or actively sanctioned the conflict. The feud finally exploded on the 10th of November, 1924, when O'Banion was murdered in his flower shop by a team of assassins, Brooklyn crime boss Frankie Yale, along with Genna gunmen Albert Anselmi and John Scalise. O'Banion had been infamous for his wild, unpredictable behavior. With his boyish grin and boisterous manner, he would slap strangers on the back with overwhelming enthusiasm, sometimes crossing dangerous lines. He once shot a man dead in broad daylight, in full view of a crowd, without provocation, and on another occasion, killed a man at Capone's own Four Deuces Club, drawing unwanted heat on Torrio and the entire Chicago underworld. O'Banion's downfall had been sealed when he tricked Torrio, who was notoriously cautious and disliked publicity, into being present at his brewery just as a police raid was about to occur. Torrio was arrested in the raid, humiliated and enraged by the betrayal. This act of deception marked the end for O'Banion. Torrio ordered his execution soon after. With O'Banion gone, the leadership of the North Side Gang passed to his close friend, Jaime Weiss, who was backed by his trusted lieutenants, Vincent Drucci and Bugs Moran. O'Banion's murder ignited a fierce desire for revenge in the Northsiders, setting the stage for a brutal 5-year gang war between the predominantly Italian-American Chicago outfit and the largely Irish-American North Side Gang. The violence erupted quickly. In January 1925, Capone survived an ambush by North Side gunmen, escaping unscathed but visibly shaken. Just 12 days later, Torrio himself was shot outside his home while returning from a shopping trip, an attack that left him seriously wounded and deeply shaken. At this point, Torrio, now in his mid-40s and having earned a vast fortune over his 2-decade-long criminal career, decided to retire from the world of organized crime. He handed over control of the Chicago outfit to his young protege, Capone, who was just 26 years old at the time. The North Side Gang continued their assaults. On the 20th of September, 1926, they staged one of their boldest attacks yet. Trying to lure Capone to a window at his Hawthorne Inn headquarters, they opened fire on the restaurant's first floor with Thompson's submachine guns, spraying over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Incredibly, Capone escaped injury, but the incident shook him deeply. Following this, Capone attempted to broker peace. He reached out to the North Side leaders, proposing a truce. Negotiations were held but ultimately failed to resolve the conflict. Barely, 3 weeks later, Capone's men retaliated, killing Jaime Weiss outside the very flower shop that had once belonged to Dean O'Banion, now serving as the North Side Gang's headquarters. The bloodshed continued. In January 1927, in revenge, Bugs Moran and Vincent Drucci kidnapped and murdered the owner of the Hawthorne Inn, a close friend of Capone's plainclas The ongoing turf war forced Capone to take his personal security more seriously than ever. He began spending more time outside of Chicago, often fleeing the city when tensions ran high. It was not unusual for Capone's entire entourage to take over a Pullman sleeper car at a Chicago train station, heading out on vacations to places like Little Rock, Hot Springs, Kansas City, Omaha, or Cleveland, where they would spend a week enjoying luxury hotels. These trips were always booked under false names, part of Capone's ever-growing precautions. For a more permanent retreat, Capone purchased a 14-room mansion in 1928, equipping it with heavy security. He also paid $40,000 to the struggling Anheuser-Busch Brewing family, producers of Budweiser, for a mansion at 93 Palm Avenue NU on Palm Island in Biscayne Bay, Miami, Florida. True to his secretive nature, the mansion was never registered in Capone's name. In fact, Capone never held property under his own name, nor did he have a bank account, instead relying on Western Union for cash transfers. Despite his criminal empire, Capone sought to build a positive public image. He made frequent charitable donations, even helping to establish a soup kitchen in Chicago during the early years of the Great Depression, a move that won him sympathy among the city's poor. Capone also cultivated political alliances, though far more subtly than during his infamous interference in the 1924 Cicero elections. Through these alliances, he secured quiet support within the political world, ensuring protection for his empire without drawing unnecessary attention. Capone also used his financial power to influence politics. He backed William Hale Thompson, the Republican candidate in the 1927 mayoral election for Chicago, donating $250,000 to his campaign. Thompson, who hinted at being sympathetic toward those arrested for bootlegging and Volstead Act violations, was an eccentric politician. He courted the Irish and Italian Roman Catholic vote and, strangely, appealed to anti-British sentiment with wild rhetoric aimed at King George V of Britain. Despite his bizarre political style, Thompson, now remembered as one of the most corrupt politicians in American history, defeated reformist rival William Emmett Dever and became mayor of Chicago. Thompson's victory allowed his mutually profitable relationship with Capone to continue, giving the gangster informal protection from law enforcement. This alliance lasted until 1929, when an event would shatter Capone's thin veil of legitimacy forever: the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Ironically, after Thompson's death in 1944, safe deposit boxes belonging to him were found containing millions of dollars, a large portion of which was almost certainly bribe money paid by Capone and his associates. Meanwhile, Bugs Moran, now the head of the North Side Gang following the death of Jaime Weiss, remained Capone's chief rival. Their feud was fueled not only by competition over bootlegging routes, but also by a personal clash of values. Moran, a devout Catholic, despised Capone's involvement in prostitution rackets, which he viewed as immoral. The violent tit-for-tat between Capone's Chicago outfit and Moran's North Side Gang reached a climax on the morning of Thursday, the 14th of February, 1929, the day of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone orchestrated a trap for Moran. An apartment was rented across from Moran's headquarters to monitor his gang's movements. Then, on the 13th of February, Moran received a phone call offering a shipment of whiskey from Detroit at a bargain price, scheduled for 10:30 a.m. the following day. Moran, seeing an opportunity, agreed to the deal, instructing his men to be present at the SMC Cartage Company on North Clark Street, where they typically stored their bootlegging trucks. But instead of whiskey, Capone arranged a fake police raid. That morning, two gangsters, disguised as plainclothesmen, and two dressed as Chicago police officers confronted 7 of Moran's men. Ordered to line up against a wall, the unsuspecting victims believed it was a routine search. But when the signal was given, the gunmen opened fire, mowing them down in cold blood. Moran himself escaped by pure chance. He had overslept that morning, avoiding the brood massacre that was intended to kill him. Nevertheless, the public shock from the massacre was enormous, especially after photographs of the slaughtered victims circulated widely in newspapers. For Capone, the fallout was immediate. His reputation as a benevolent outlaw was shattered, and he was branded public enemy number one. Federal authorities, who had until then left Capone mostly to Illinois officials, now stepped in, determined to bring him down. Questions also swirled around Mayor Thompson, whose ties to Capone became a source of public outrage. Moran's reaction to the carnage broke the traditional gangster code of silence. He openly accused Capone of orchestrating the massacre, giving law enforcement a clear suspect. Capone was summoned to court, but twice claimed illness and failed to appear. Ultimately, because no direct evidence linked him to the crime scene, the charges were dropped. Capone's tactics had worked this time, but the federal government was now focused on taking him down by any means necessary. Though Capone was notorious for letting others do his dirty work, one chilling story suggests he occasionally got his hands dirty himself. According to legend, Capone personally dealt with three disloyal gangsters, Scalise, Anselmi, and Junta, who he suspected of plotting against him with a rival boss. The story claims that after inviting the men to a dinner and plying them with food and drink, Capone savagely beat them with a baseball bat, striking them in the head before having his men finish them off with gunfire. While this account was widely reported in newspapers at the time, and one associate claimed to have witnessed both the planning and the execution, some historians question its accuracy, suggesting it may have been exaggerated to enhance Capone's fearsome reputation. Stories like this, whether entirely true or not, helped fuel the legend of Al Capone as a ruthless, hands-on mob boss, ruling Chicago's underworld through a combination of brutality, charisma, and cunning. The men who carried out Capone's orders contributed to the growing legend surrounding him. By the late 1920s, he was widely regarded as a volatile and unpredictable figure, prone to sudden outbursts of anger, jealousy, and violence, as well as erratic behavior. When evaluating this side of Capone's character, it is important to remember that he was not only a heavy drinker, but also a regular drug user. Although drug abuse is often associated with later decades, such as the 1970s, Class A narcotics were already being illicitly traded in the United States as early as the 1920s. In fact, recreational drug use dated back to the late 19th century, when substances like cocaine and morphine were commonly used in hospitals as anesthetics and were poorly regulated. By the mid-1920s, Capone had become a habitual user, and his drug abuse eventually resulted in a deviated septum. When combined with his excessive alcohol consumption, his narcotic use likely contributed to his increasing paranoia and violent tendencies, helping to explain much of his conduct as the feared boss of Chicago's underworld during the Prohibition era. Yet, despite his violent reputation, there was another, lesser-known side to Al Capone. He was, for example, deeply protective of his son Sonny, who had been born with a hearing impairment. Both Al and his wife May made sure Sonny received the best medical care possible, even traveling as far as New York to consult leading specialists in the hope of improving his condition. Capone also had a profound love of music, spanning several genres. In the 1920s, after acquiring a phonograph, he spent countless hours lounging and listening to operas, even going so far as to study the lyrics, sometimes writing out his own versions. Over time, he grew confident in his musical knowledge and began attending live opera performances in Chicago's theaters, always flanked by bodyguards. One urban legend recounts how, during a performance, Capone's bodyguards mistook a brief intermission for the end of the show and started to leave. Capone stopped them, saying, "It ain't over till the fat lady sings." Whether this moment inspired the famous phrase is debatable, but it speaks to Capone's unexpected love of the arts. His musical tastes were not limited to opera. Capone was also a fan of jazz, the defining sound of the 1920s. This passion famously led to an incident in January 1926, when some of his men kidnapped jazz pianist Thomas Fats Waller. Fearing for his life, Waller was relieved to discover that he had been brought not to be harmed, but to perform at Capone's lavish 27th birthday party at the Hawthorne Inn. By 1929, the government's efforts to bring down public enemy number one intensified. On the 27th of March, 1929, FBI agents arrested Capone as he left a courtroom where he had been testifying before a grand jury investigating Prohibition violations. This time, the charge was that Capone had faked illness to avoid a previous court appearance. But Capone's legal troubles were far from over. On May 16, 1929, he was arrested again, this time in Philadelphia, for carrying a concealed weapon. He stood trial, was found guilty, and was sentenced to 1 year in prison. On the 8th of August, 1929, Capone was sent to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, where he served just 7 months before his release in March 1930. However, barely a month later, in April 1930, Capone was arrested once again, this time on vagrancy charges during a trip to Miami Beach. During his detention, Capone claimed that the police had threatened his family and denied him food and water. For making these claims, he was charged with perjury. After a 3-day trial in July 1930, Capone was found not guilty, but the government's determination to prosecute him was only growing stronger. In February 1931, Capone faced yet another trial, this time on a charge of contempt of court, stemming from his earlier illness claims. Presiding over the case was Judge James Herbert Wilkerson, who carefully questioned the testimony of Capone's doctors, exposing inconsistencies and aiding the prosecution's efforts to bring him down. Though Capone was sentenced to 6 months in prison, he remained free for the time being while his legal team worked to appeal the conviction. Nevertheless, it was clear that the walls were closing in on Alphonse Capone. Even as he faced mounting legal troubles in Chicago, Capone was peripherally involved in some of the most pivotal moments in the rise of the Italian-American mafia, particularly in New York City and New Jersey, although crime syndicates as far west as Chicago inevitably became entangled in these power struggles. In November 1928, Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish-American gangster who had acted as a kind of unofficial mediator for the New York underworld throughout the 1920s, was murdered over an unpaid gambling debt. His death created a dangerous power vacuum. Into this void stepped Joe Masseria, who became the head of the Italian-American factions, aligning himself with prominent mobsters such as Charles Lucky, Luciano Meyer, Lansky, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. But trouble soon followed. Another recently arrived Sicilian, Salvatore Maranzano, sought to challenge Masseria's authority and carve out power for himself. This struggle ignited a bloody conflict known as the Castellamarese War, named after Castellammare del Golfo, the Sicilian town where Maranzano was born. Capone, despite his mounting legal problems, sided with Masseria, although his involvement was limited due to his own precarious situation back in Chicago. In the end, however, Luciano betrayed Masseria, orchestrating his murder. Luciano briefly worked with Maranzano, but when Maranzano attempted to declare himself the boss of bosses, Luciano turned on him too, having him killed in 1931. It was at this turning point that Luciano convened a historic meeting of mafia leaders, bringing together the heads of the New York crime families, as well as representatives from Buffalo and Chicago, to establish the Commission. This body would serve to mediate disputes and govern the operations of the Italian-American mafia without a single supreme leader. It is often assumed that Al Capone briefly served as the Chicago representative on the Pass Commission, though in reality, Capone was embroiled in serious court proceedings in Chicago at the time. The question of who truly led the Chicago outfit during these critical years was somewhat uncertain, as Capone's leadership was under threat from the law. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, as the Castellamarese War raged in New York, law enforcement officials working in tandem with police in Miami were intensifying efforts to finally bring Capone to justice. It was during this period that Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrandt devised an unorthodox legal strategy. She observed that the extravagant lifestyles of gangsters like Capone were impossible to reconcile with their declared income. Many of them filed no tax returns at all, and those who did grossly understated their earnings despite owning lavish homes in Chicago and Florida. Willebrandt proposed prosecuting gangsters for tax evasion, sidestepping the immense difficulty of proving their involvement in bootlegging, racketeering, and murder. This legal tactic was first tested in United States v. Sullivan, A case brought against bootlegger Manly Sullivan. Sullivan was convicted of tax evasion, though he appealed on Fifth Amendment grounds, claiming the right not to incriminate himself. The case provided valuable insights into how such prosecutions might succeed. With this legal precedent in hand, the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, assigned Frank J. Wilson, a meticulous investigator, to examine Capone's finances. Wilson's job was to track Capone's extravagant spending and contrast it with his reported income. The key to securing a conviction would lie in proving Capone's real earnings and demonstrating the staggering disparity between his lifestyle and the paltry income claimed on his tax returns. Unwittingly, Capone undermined his own defense when he attempted to put his financial affairs in order. On the advice of his legal team, he offered to pay taxes on a declared income, thereby admitting that he had previously failed to pay taxes. Following his instructions, his lawyers reported taxable income for $1,928 and $1,929 each year, amounting to $100,000. Since he had never paid taxes on these sums, this declaration amounted to an outright admission of guilt. On the 13th of March, 1931, Capone was formally charged with income tax evasion for the year 1924, and on the 5th of June, a federal grand jury indicted him on 22 counts of tax evasion, covering the years 1925 to 1929. He was released shortly after on a $50,000 bail. Only a week after the indictment, another major figure entered the pursuit of Capone. Eliot Ness, the incorruptible Prohibition agent who had become famous for his relentless efforts. Ness was part of the U.S. Treasury Department, having joined in 1926 and worked within the Bureau of Prohibition in Chicago. His mission was clear: to dismantle Capone's bootlegging empire and uncover a criminal conspiracy to violate the National Prohibition Act, also known as the Volstead Act. Ness and his team carried out dozens of raids on Capone's illegal breweries and distilleries, destroying his operations and inflicting an estimated $9 million loss in revenue. Much of their intelligence came from the innovative use of wiretaps on Capone's phone lines, a cutting-edge technique at the time. Altogether, Ness compiled evidence for over 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act, dealing a massive blow to Capone's finances. As Ness presented his substantial findings, Capone was already facing tax evasion charges in court. Thus, when Capone finally stood before Judge James Herbert Wilkerson on the 16th of June, 1931, the very judge who had previously convicted Capone's brother, Ralph Capone, for tax evasion in 1930, he made a strategic decision. Capone pleaded guilty, expecting to receive a plea deal limiting his sentence to just 2.5 years. It seemed at first that Capone had secured a light punishment considering the mountain of evidence against him, but Judge Wilkerson had no intention of letting him off easily. At the prime sentencing hearing on the 30th of July, 1931, Wilkerson refused to honor the plea bargain. One of Capone's attorneys immediately moved to withdraw the guilty plea, arguing that an attorney could not legally admit guilt on behalf of his client without the client's direct consent. The defense further argued that Capone's lawyers had no authority to admit to the incoming question. Wilkerson dismissed these arguments, ruling that any statement made by an attorney to a railroad federal agency carried the full weight of an admission of guilt, done at the risk of the Froman defendant. Therefore, Capone's letter to federal authorities acknowledging his past income was allowed into evidence. Wilkerson decided that Capone would be tried on the tax evasion charges alone, deeming them more significant than the prohibition violations. This ruling dealt a serious blow to Capone's defense team, who had prepared almost exclusively for a plea deal. Now, they had mere hours to scramble together a defense for a full criminal trial. In the end, their only strategy was a flimsy one. They argued that Capone's reported income had been absorbed by his severe gambling habit, suggesting his profits were offset by his losses. But this defense failed to hold water. Gambling losses could only be deducted from gambling winnings, not used as an excuse for failing to file a tax return. But Capone's expenditures told a different story. His lifestyle indicated that significant Funds had to be available to cover his extensive gambling activity. Therefore, if he had indeed lost large amounts through betting, then his actual income must have been even higher than initially estimated. The prosecution then laid out, in meticulous detail, the full extent of Capone's spending in court. After compiling all the evidence, they concluded that Capone had evaded $215,000 in taxes on a gross income of $1,386,654 over a 5-year period. With the case made on the 31st of October, 1931, Al Capone was convicted on 3 counts of income tax evasion. A week later, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, in order to pay $7,695 in court costs. In addition, he remained liable for the $215,000 in back taxes plus interest. Capone's response to the conviction was to hire a team of expert tax lawyers from Washington, D.C., who filed a writ of habeas corpus, a legal request requiring that the detainee be brought before a court to determine whether their imprisonment was lawful. Their argument centered on a Supreme Court precedent that had declared tax evasion was not fraud, suggesting that the statute of limitations may have expired on some of the tax years for which Capone had been convicted. However, the judge ruled that Capone's time spent in Miami during the 1920s and early 1930s should be excluded from the statute of limitations, since those years were not spent in Illinois, the jurisdiction where the charges originated. As a result, the appeal was denied, both in terms of the conviction and the sentence. Following this final failed appeal, Capone was transferred to Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary on May 3, 1932, at the age of 33. Among the federal agents who escorted him from Cook County Jail to Atlanta was Elliot Ness, this being the only confirmed occasion the two men ever met in person. Upon arrival, Capone weighed 250 pounds, and during his medical intake, he was diagnosed with syphilis, gonorrhea, and a perforated nasal septum, the latter caused by years of excessive drug use. He also suffered from withdrawal symptoms, as his body adjusted to life without narcotics. While in Atlanta, Capone was assigned the task of stitching soles onto shoes, a job he carried out competently. However, he was not well liked among his fellow inmates, who saw him as a weak figure, unable to withstand the bullying that was common inside the prison. Some also believed Capone was receiving special treatment, a perception likely influenced by the protection he received from his cellmate, Red Rudensky, a seasoned criminal linked to the Southside Gang. Rudensky had taken it upon himself to look after Capone, whose physical and mental health was rapidly declining due to the advanced effects of syphilis. Between the growing hostility from other inmates, the increasingly incoherent letters Capone wrote home, and Rudensky's concern that he was close to a mental breakdown, prison officials made a pointleisture and decision. In August 1934, Capone was transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, located off the coast of San Francisco. His new home would be Cell 181 on the notorious island. On the 23rd of June, 1936, Capone was attacked in the prison laundry room by a fellow inmate, James Tex Lucas, who was serving a life sentence for bank robbery. Lucas stabbed Capone in the back with a pair of scissors stolen from the prison barber. Fortunately, the wound was only superficial, and Capone managed to throw Lucas against a wall in retaliation. After the attack, Lucas was placed in solitary confinement as punishment. During Capone's remaining years at Alcatraz, his syphilis worsened, gradually eroding his mental faculties. By February 1938, doctors formally diagnosed him with neurosyphilis, or syphilis of the placens brain, a condition that left him increasingly disoriented and confused. He spent the final year of his sentence confined to the prison hospital ward, mentally diminished and physically frail. When Capone was released from Alcatraz on the 6th of January, 1939, he was not yet a free man. He was immediately transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in California, where he was required to serve out the remainder of his sentence, contempt of court. On the 16th of November, 1939, after a plea from his wife, May Capone, who argued that his mental state had severely deteriorated. He was granted parole. Meanwhile, in Chicago, the South Side gang had undergone a leadership change. Control passed to Frank Nitti, one of Capone's former bodyguards, and a man who had long been in charge of managing the outfit's financial affairs. Nitti had served prison time himself for tax evasion, and after his release in March 1932, he assumed the role of acting and later de facto head of the Chicago outfit. Under Nitti's leadership, the outfit continued its operations but adopted a lower profile. This new, discreet approach blurred the lines of leadership, making it difficult for outsiders to know who truly controlled the organization. Still, organized crime thrived, with the outfit deeply involved in prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, and labor union racketeering, even after the end of Prohibition in 1933. Upon his release on the 16th of November, 1939, Capone's failing health led him to seek treatment at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, but due to his notorious reputation, the hospital refused to admit him. He was instead treated at Union Memorial Hospital, where doctors addressed his paresis, the late-stage neurological condition caused by syphilis. As a gesture of gratitude, Capone donated 2 Japanese cherry trees to the hospital. Capone left the hospital on the 20th of March, 1940, and returned to his estate on Palm Island in Florida. There, he became one of the first Americans to be treated with penicillin, the new wonder drug. Unfortunately, while penicillin slowed the disease's progress, it came too late to reverse the irreversible brain damage caused by syphilis. On Palm Island, Capone was cared for by his wife, May, who remained devoted despite all that had transpired: their decade-long fall from grace, his many infidelities in the 1920s, and the likelihood that he had transmitted syphilis to her, which may have prevented them from having more children after their son Sonny, born in 1918. May had stood by him throughout his years in prison and would continue to care for him during his final decline. In his last years, Capone was examined by a Baltimore psychiatrist and his personal physician, both of whom concluded that his mental capacity had deteriorated to that of a 12-year-old child. On the 21st of January, 1947, Capone suffered a stroke. Though he initially showed signs of recovery, he soon contracted bronchopneumonia, which was then followed by cardiac arrest on the 22nd of January. Just a few days later, on the 25th of January, 1947, Capone died of heart failure caused by apoplexy, having celebrated his 48th birthday just 1 week earlier. He passed away at his Palm Island home, surrounded by his family. A private funeral was held in Chicago a week later, and he was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery, closing the final chapter in the turbulent life of one of America's most infamous gangsters. 3 years later, in 1950, Capone's remains, along with those of his father, Gabriele Capone, and his brother, Salvatore Capone, were exhumed and reinterred at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. With Capone's death, a chapter in Chicago's criminal history came to a close, though by 1947, Capone had already been out of the city's underworld for many years. Still, his legacy loomed large over Chicago long after his fall from power. At the start of the 1930s, more than anyone, certainly more than predecessors like Big Jim Colosimo or Johnny Torrio, 2 far more cautious crime bosses, Al Capone transformed Chicago into one of the most violent cities in North America. Through his confrontational tactics and his ruthless use of violence, he changed the entire criminal culture of the city. Even as Prohibition ended and Capone faded from power, Chicago remained a hotbed of crime during the Great Depression. Figures like John Dillinger and his notorious gang of bank robbers operated from Chicago, and it was there that Dillinger was famously gunned down in 1934. Dillinger's associate, Babyface Nelson, born Lester Joseph Gillis, also worked out of Chicago, eventually dying in a violent gun battle with the FBI in the suburbs of Barrington on the 27th of November, 1934, an event so bloody it became known as the Battle of Barrington. Chicago was also home base for other infamous criminals, such as Alvin Karpis and Charles, Pretty Boy Floyd, who terrorized the Midwest during their crime sprees, including the Kansas City Massacre, where 4 law enforcement officers were murdered in Kansas on June 17, 1933. In this way, Capone's violent rise in the 1920s had set a new precedent for how organized crime operated in Chicago. His example shaped a criminal culture that endured for decades, one that both law enforcement and ordinary Chicagoans struggled to contain long after Capone himself was gone. Al Capone remains one of the most iconic gangsters of the Prohibition era. While forever associated with Chicago, his roots were actually in Brooklyn, New York, where he grew up among the Italian-American working class. Like many immigrant youths of his time, Capone faced a stark choice in a society where anti-immigrant sentiment against Italians, Irish, Jews, and Germans was rampant. Follow the law and live in poverty, or join the Papitou de Souza underworld in search of power and fortune. Ironically, it was this very anti-immigrant sentiment that helped fuel Prohibition in 1920, which, in part, sought to undermine the economic base of immigrant communities that controlled much of the bar and brewing trade. By the time Prohibition became law, Capone was already an established gangster. Having completed his criminal apprenticeship in New York, he followed his mentor, Johnny Torrio, to Chicago. What followed was a decade of unrelenting violence, as Capone sought to dominate the city's criminal scene, crushing rival Irish-American gangs like those led by Dean O'Banion and Bugs Moran. Capone's methods were often recklessly provocative, most notably with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, an act of such brutality that it severed his political protection in Chicago, even among those officials who had previously accepted his bribes to shield him from federal investigation. In the end, it was this lack of caution and subtlety that destroyed him. Unlike his New York counterpart, Charles Lucky Luciano, who worked tirelessly to avoid unwanted attention, Capone craved the spotlight. This, combined with his deteriorating health due to syphilis, ensured that his reign over Chicago's underworld and his life would be cut tragically short. So what do you think of Al Capone? Was he a modern-day Robin Hood, a man who used his fortune to help the poor while giving the public what they wanted, or was he a cold, blooded killer whose pursuit of wealth and luxury left Chicago scarred by violence in the post-1920s and ultimately led to his own downfall? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. And as always, thank you for watching.